It's day 45 of deployment, and 400 feet beneath the North Atlantic, Seaman Rodriguez sits on the edge of his bunk in the USS Virginia, staring at the curved steel wall just 18 inches from his face. He hasn't seen sunlight in 6 weeks. He hasn't breathed fresh air since leaving port. The artificial fluorescent lighting never changes. The recycled air tastes metallic, and the constant hum of machinery has become the soundtrack to his slowly fraying sanity. Above him, another sailor sleeps fitfully in a bunk so close that Rodriguez can feel his shipmate's every movement. Below him, a third crew member tosses restlessly, muttering in his sleep about home. Welcome to the harsh reality of submarine life, where the conditions on a submarine can be difficult because crew members must work in isolation for long periods of time without family contact and in cramped conditions that would challenge even the most mentally resilient individuals. This isn't the romanticized submarine warfare of Hollywood movies. It's a psychological and physical endurance test that pushes human beings to their absolute breaking point, and sometimes beyond. The statistics tell a sobering story. 30% of all losses to the submarine force were due to mental health diagnoses, revealing that the greatest enemy facing submarine crews isn't enemy torpedoes or mechanical failures. It's the crushing psychological pressure of life underwater. Space is limited, privacy is minimal, and the 18-hour day split into 3 6-hour shifts takes getting used to, but that's just the beginning of challenges that most people couldn't endure for a single week, let alone months at a time. These aren't just discomforts. They're systematic assaults on human psychology that transform ordinary sailors into something approaching psychological prisoners trapped in a steel tube surrounded by crushing water pressure and dependent entirely on recycled air, artificial light, and the mental stability of 134 other people who are experiencing the exact same psychological breakdown. Over the next few minutes, we'll explore the brutal realities that submarine recruitment posters never mention: the claustrophobia, the depression, the interpersonal conflicts, and the psychological conditions that can destroy careers and lives beneath the waves. The physical environment aboard a nuclear submarine represents one of the most hostile living conditions ever deliberately imposed on human beings. Submariners live in extremely cramped conditions with limited privacy, often sharing space with torpedoes or food supplies, and practicing hot racking, where multiple sailors share a limited number of beds. Imagine trying to sleep in a space smaller than a coffin, knowing that as soon as you wake up, someone else will climb into your still warm sheets and try to find rest in the same cramped bunk. The submarine's living quarters redefine the concept of personal space. Individual sleeping areas measure roughly 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet high, dimensions that would be considered inhumane for prisoners in most civilized countries. Yet, submarine crews must call this home for months at a time, storing their personal belongings in tiny lockers that would be insufficient for a weekend camping trip. Privacy becomes a luxury that simply doesn't exist. Every conversation can be overheard, every personal moment observed, every private struggle witnessed by dozens of shipmates. They have limited access to open space, natural settings, fresh air, fresh food, sunlight, privacy, exercise, and outside communication. Deprivations that systematically assault every basic human need for psychological well-being. The absence of natural light creates a form of sensory deprivation that disrupts circadian rhythms within days. The recycled air, filtered and refiltered through mechanical systems, carries the constant taste of machine oil and human exhalation. Fresh food disappears within 2 weeks, replaced by processed meals that provide nutrition but little comfort. Exercise becomes a cruel joke in an environment where the gym might be a narrow corridor between missile tubes or a small space in the torpedo compartment that doubles as sleeping quarters for junior sailors. Physical fitness deteriorates rapidly in an environment where a brisk walk is impossible, fresh air doesn't exist, and the most strenuous activity might be climbing a ladder between decks. The physical discomfort extends to basic human functions that most people take for granted. Showers are limited to precious minutes per week, with water restrictions that make proper hygiene a constant challenge. Bathroom facilities are shared among dozens of crew members, creating lines and scheduling conflicts that add stress to the most basic bodily needs. Sleep becomes fragmented and unsatisfying, interrupted by shift changes, emergency drills, and the constant noise of machinery that never stops. Temperature control represents another form of physical torture, with some compartments sweltering from reactor heat while others remain uncomfortably cold. Humidity levels fluctuate wildly, creating condensation that drips constantly from overhead pipes and making everything feel damp and clammy. The submarine's motion through ocean swells can trigger seasickness that persists for weeks, particularly in rough weather when the vessel rolls and pitches unpredictably. Perhaps most distressing is the complete absence of escape from these conditions. On surface ships, sailors can step outside, breathe fresh air, and see the horizon. Submarine crews exist in a sealed environment where relief is impossible, where every physical discomfort becomes magnified by the knowledge that it will continue for months without respite. The human mind, evolved for open spaces and natural light, rebels violently against the submarine environment, creating psychological conditions so severe that military psychiatrists have given them a formal diagnosis. Issues such as anxiety, mood swings, and interpersonal conflicts have been documented. The lack of natural light and fresh air, the long working hours, and the sleep disruptions due to shift work can lead to a condition known as submarine syndrome, characterized by depression, irritability, and fatigue that can destroy careers and endanger entire crews. Submarine syndrome manifests differently in each sailor, but the symptoms follow predictable patterns that experienced submarine commanders learn to recognize. Early signs include increased irritability over minor issues, difficulty concentrating on routine tasks, and social withdrawal from shipmates. As the condition progresses, affected sailors may experience panic attacks triggered by the submarine's confined spaces, paranoid thoughts about equipment failures or enemy attacks, and deep depression that makes even basic daily functions feel overwhelming. The artificial day cycle compounds these psychological pressures in ways that civilian life never prepares people to handle. Living on an 18-hour day is rough, but I always felt that the worst part was changing back and forth between a 24-hour day and the 18-hour day, according to veteran submariners who describe the constant schedule disruption as a form of chronic jet lag that never allows the body to establish normal sleep patterns. This temporal disorientation affects everything from appetite to emotional regulation, creating a persistent sense of confusion about basic daily rhythms. Sleep deprivation becomes both cause and symptom of psychological breakdown aboard submarines. The combination of shift work, cramped sleeping conditions, and constant noise makes restorative sleep nearly impossible for many crew members. Sailors describe lying in their bunks for hours, exhausted but unable to achieve deep sleep, their minds racing with anxiety about equipment failures, family problems back home, or simply the crushing realization that they have months more of this existence ahead of them. The case histories of 261 submarines disqualified psychiatrically for further submarine duty revealed that the major symptomatology was emotional in nature, not the claustrophobia that most people would expect. Instead, submariners suffer from depression, anxiety disorders, and emotional instability that manifests as unpredictable mood swings, inappropriate anger responses, and inability to maintain normal interpersonal relationships with shipmates. The psychological pressure is intensified by the high-stakes nature of submarine operations. Unlike other military jobs where mistakes might result in disciplinary action, submarine errors can kill everyone aboard. This constant awareness of deadly consequences creates a psychological burden that weighs on crew members around the clock, making every decision feel like a life or death choice, and every minor equipment problem seem like potential catastrophe. Perhaps most devastating is the realization that escape is impossible. Soldiers on land can be evacuated if they suffer psychological breakdown. Sailors on surface ships can be transferred to other vessels or airlifted to hospitals. Submarine crews must endure their psychological crisis in the same confined space that caused it, surrounded by the same people who witnessed their breakdown, with no possibility of relief until the submarine returns to port months later. The isolation from the outside world aboard a submarine creates a unique form of psychological torture that affects every aspect of human relationships. Submarines normally maintain radio silence to avoid detection, cutting crew members off from families, friends, and the normal social connections that anchor most people's emotional stability. For months at a time, sailors exist in a social vacuum where the only human contact comes from the same 134 people they see every single day, creating interpersonal dynamics that can become toxic with frightening speed. Communication with loved ones becomes a precious commodity rationed like food or fresh water. When communication is possible, messages are delayed, censored for security, and often brief to the point of meaninglessness. Sailors describe the agony of receiving weeks-old emails about family crises they cannot help resolve, relationship problems they cannot address, or simply the mundane details of a life that seems increasingly foreign and distant. Many submariners report feeling like strangers to their own families after extended deployments, unable to relate to experiences they didn't share or problems they couldn't help solve. The confined social environment creates interpersonal pressure cookers where minor personality conflicts can explode into crew-threatening incidents. Imagine being locked in a small room with the same people for 6 months, where someone's annoying laugh, poor hygiene habits, or irritating conversational style becomes a source of rage so intense it threatens your sanity. Veterans describe developing irrational hatred for shipmates based on trivial behaviors, the way someone chews their food, breathes too loudly while sleeping, or tells the same stories repeatedly. These social tensions are exacerbated by the complete absence of privacy or personal space where conflicts can be avoided. Unlike civilian life, where personality clashes can be resolved by avoiding certain people, submarine crews must work, eat, sleep, and socialize in the same confined spaces regardless of personal animosity. Sailors must maintain professional relationships with people they've grown to despise, creating psychological stress that builds continuously throughout the deployment. The research reveals higher overall anxiety and depression levels in comparison to SSBN submariners, suggesting that different types of submarine missions create varying levels of psychological strain. Attack submarine crews, who conduct more dynamic operations with frequent changes in mission and higher operational tempo, experience different but equally severe psychological challenges compared to ballistic missile submarine crews, who endure longer periods of monotonous patrol duty. Hierarchy and military discipline add another layer of complexity to submarine social dynamics. Junior sailors must defer to senior personnel regardless of personal feelings, creating power dynamics that can become abusive in the confined submarine environment. Workplace harassment, bullying, and abuse of authority become magnified when victims cannot escape their tormentors and must continue working in close proximity for months. The breakdown of normal social boundaries creates situations where personal conflicts become public spectacles witnessed by the entire crew. Arguments between sailors become entertainment for bored shipmates, personal breakdowns become gossip that spreads throughout the boat, and private struggles become shared knowledge that can destroy reputations and careers long after the submarine returns to port. The modern submarine service faces a mental health crisis that threatens to undermine the entire underwater warfare capability of the Navy. The millennials, the ones who are coming into the submarine force today, are tremendously different than the young men who came into the submarine force. In World War II, different motivations, different aspirations, different understanding, according to senior submarine commanders who struggled to adapt traditional military culture to a generation raised with constant digital connectivity, social media interaction, and immediate access to mental health resources. Today's submarine recruits arrive with psychological expectations that clash violently with submarine reality. They're accustomed to constant communication with friends and family, instant access to entertainment and information, and personal spaces that provide privacy and comfort. The submarine environment strips away every psychological coping mechanism that modern young adults have developed, leaving them defenseless against isolation, boredom, and confinement that would have been familiar to prisoners in medieval dungeons. The mental health support systems designed for surface Navy personnel prove inadequate for the unique stresses of submarine duty. Traditional counseling requires privacy and confidentiality that don't exist aboard submarines, where conversations can be overheard and psychological problems become known throughout the crew. Medication management becomes complicated in an environment where side effects could compromise safety, and where the submarine's corpsmen may lack specialized psychiatric training needed to address serious mental health crises. Psychological screening failures have resulted in devastating incidents that highlight the inadequacy of current mental health evaluation procedures. Sailors who passed psychological evaluations have suffered complete mental breakdowns underwater, becoming dangers to themselves and their shipmates in an environment where restraint options are limited and evacuation impossible. Some have attempted suicide in spaces where their deaths could endanger the entire crew, while others have suffered psychotic breaks that required physical restraint by shipmates. The real consequences of psychological breakdown underwater extend far beyond individual suffering. When a sailor suffers a mental health crisis aboard a submarine, it affects operational capability, crew morale, and mission effectiveness in ways that can compromise national security. Emergency psychological evacuations require submarines to surface and rendezvous with other vessels, potentially compromising classified missions and revealing submarine positions to enemy surveillance. The stigma surrounding mental health in military culture becomes magnified in the submarine community, where psychological problems are seen as disqualifying weaknesses rather than treatable medical conditions. Sailors hide symptoms of depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues rather than seeking help, knowing that psychological problems can end submarine careers and result in permanent disqualification from the service they've trained years to join. Command structures aboard submarines often lack the training and resources needed to identify and address mental health problems before they become crises. Submarine officers focus on technical competence and operational readiness rather than crew psychological welfare, missing warning signs that could prevent psychological emergencies. The result is a system that reacts to mental health crises rather than preventing them, creating unnecessary suffering and operational risk that could be avoided with better psychological support systems. The harsh reality of submarine life reveals the extraordinary price that human beings pay to maintain underwater military capabilities that most people never see or appreciate. For over a century, submarine crews have endured conditions that would be considered torture if imposed on prisoners, accepting psychological and physical hardships that push human endurance to its absolute limits. They sacrifice their mental health, their relationships, and sometimes their sanity to patrol the world's oceans in steel tubes that become floating prisons for months at a time. The scale of human endurance required for submarine service challenges our understanding of what ordinary people can survive. These aren't superhuman warriors selected for extraordinary psychological resilience. They're regular young men and women who volunteered for service they didn't fully understand, then discovered reserves of mental toughness they never knew they possessed. They learn to sleep in coffin-sized spaces, work in isolation from everything they love, and maintain their sanity while surrounded by weapons that could destroy civilization. The hidden cost of underwater military operations extends far beyond the billions of dollars spent on submarine construction and maintenance. The real expense is measured in broken marriages, damaged psyches, and careers ended by mental health problems that develop in environments no human being was meant to endure. The submarine service consumes young sailors and transforms them into something harder, more isolated, and often more damaged than the people who entered the service. Yet somehow, they continue to serve. Despite the claustrophobia, the depression, the interpersonal conflicts, and the psychological breakdown that awaits many submarine sailors, new volunteers continue to raise their hands and accept assignments that will test every aspect of their humanity. They do this not because submarine life is easy or comfortable, but because they understand that someone must bear these burdens to maintain the underwater capabilities that protect their nation. Their sacrifice deserves recognition not for its glory, but for its grinding, relentless difficulty. These are the forgotten casualties of modern warfare. Sailors who return from deployments psychologically scarred by months of enduring conditions that most people couldn't survive for days.